Well, it can mean a lot of things. In its most general sense, it's just change over time. It can mean the history of the cosmos. It can mean the development of technology. In all of these senses, evolution is utterly uncontroversial. At least I don't know anyone who thinks that things never change. Another meaning for evolution in biology is that living things were once different from what we see around us now. The past is different from the present. This is called a change in the biosphere, the makeup of the living things on our planet. And there is a history to life. Nobody denies it that I know. Something else evolution can mean in biology is minor changes within existing species. We can actually see this in our own families. We're different from our parents. They're different from their parents. We're different from our brothers and sisters. And farmers have been seeing this for centuries in domestic breeding with plants and animals. So minor changes within existing species, again, are uncontroversial. Darwin took things a step further, though. For him, the minor changes we see in existing species, if given enough time, lead to new species, organs, and body plans. Along the way, beneficial variations are preserved and harmful variations are eliminated by natural selection, or survival of the fittest. For Darwin, there was no design in this process. He once wrote, "There seems to be no more design in the variability of organic beings and in the action of natural selection than in the course which the wind blows." So he called his book, The Origin of Species, one long argument. And the argument took this form. He would point to something in the biosphere and argue that it was inexplicable on the theory of creation, but made sense from the point of view of his theory of descent with modification. Starting with the fourth edition of The Origin of Species, Darwin also argued that the idea that living things were created according to a plan is, quote, not a scientific explanation, unquote. Now, Darwin's book had no evidence for natural selection. He had none at the time. All he could offer was, as he put it, one or two imaginary illustrations. Furthermore, despite the title of his book, he never solved the origin of species. According to historian Neil Gillespie, writing about 40 years ago, it is sometimes said that Darwin converted the scientific world to evolution by showing them the process by which it had occurred. Yet it was actually more Darwin's insistence on totally natural explanations than on natural selection that won their adherence. Which is one reason why we hear so little nowadays about Darwin's contemporary, Alfred Russel Wallace, who also proposed a theory of natural selection. In fact, Wallace had more evidence for his theory than Darwin had for his. And the two men, or the two theories, were presented on the same day in 1858. Yet we almost never hear of Wallace, who believed that natural selection could not account for our brain, our organs of speech, our hand, or the external form of human beings. For Wallace, there had to be an overruling intelligence involved. Well, this idea horrified Darwin because the point of his book was to show that there was no intelligence involved. Historian Michael Flannery has written, Darwin's book was a framework that served not only to bolster a materialistic metaphysic, but in effect proposed to become its operative manifesto. Darwinian evolution, according to Flannery, far from being evidence-based science, is one long argument in favor of materialistic philosophy. So Darwin's theory relied less on evidence than on a theological argument, that is, an argument against creation by design, and a philosophical argument, that is, a definition of science that excluded design, a definition that changed what people had thought of science before. So controversies over evolution ever since Darwin have always involved theology and philosophy. It was there from the very beginning. In the 1930s, a follower of Darwin's, Theodosius Dobzhansky, evolutionary biologist, wrote something very interesting. He distinguished between what he called microevolution and macroevolution. And here's what he wrote. There is no way toward an understanding of the mechanisms of macroevolutionary changes other than through a full comprehension of microevolutionary processes that we can observe within our own lifetimes. Now, microevolution refers to minor changes within existing species. Macroevolution for Dobzhansky meant the origin of new species, organs, and body plans. So Dobzhansky concluded, for this reason, we are compelled at the present level of knowledge reluctantly to put a sign of equality between the mechanisms of macro and microevolutions, and proceeding on this assumption to push our investigations as far ahead as this working hypothesis will permit. Now, although Darwin didn't use the words Dobzhansky used, the essence of Darwin's theory is essentially Dobzhansky's extrapolation. That is, microevolution given long enough will lead to macroevolution. Note that Darwin did not write a book titled How Existing Species Change Over Time. If he had, probably no one would have noticed. Instead, he wrote a book titled The Origin of Species. Now, today, the scientific consensus is to lump microevolution and macroevolution together. Eugenie Scott, former director of the Pro-Evolution National Center for Science Education, wrote years ago that she would introduce college students to evolution as an issue of the history of the planet, as the way we try to understand change through time. The present is different from the past. Evolution happened, there's no debate within science as to whether it happened, and so on. Well, she's right about that, but that's referring, of course, to microevolution. But then Scott advocated confusing students by using the same term to cover macroevolution. She explained that only after she got the students nodding in assent to her change over time definition would she bring in Darwin's, quote, big idea, unquote, of unguided macroevolution. But that, she wrote, is what we want students to know about organic evolution. The scientific consensus now is not just to confuse microevolution and macroevolution, but also to present evolution as though it were a fact. I will argue throughout these lectures that that's not true. But to save time and avoid long-windedness in my lectures, I will use the word evolution to mean what the consensus means, that is, unguided macroevolution, unless I specify otherwise.